Forum. This is session 173. Today we'll focus the discussion on autonomy. And our main speaker is Karl Iagnemma. He's one of the few that has lived the full arc of autonomy, from science to engineer and then to business, right? And today we'll cover many topics, but before we introduce the substance, I do want to reinforce the norm of this forum. That is, everybody contribute one idea. Here are specifically referring to the audience. Please type into the chat a question or a comment to our conversation there, right? Our main speaker is Karl, and also have the pleasure to have Gil Pratt join us as a commentator. So I'll first invite each of you to say a few words about yourself to introduce to the audience. Karl, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Jinhua and John, for inviting me to participate. It's obviously a great audience and obviously a topic close to my heart. My background, I started my career in the academic space, was at MIT for about a dozen years, directing a research lab called the Robotic Mobility Group. This was a mobile robotics lab. I kind of refer to that as the bad old days of robotics. It was really the good old days, but the bad old days in the sense that stuff didn't really work all that well. When we got something to work, we would capture a video of it very excitedly and show it at the next conference on a VHS tape. That was actually okay because the whole, currency at that time was proof of concept and demonstrating the possible, and that's what we were doing. Had a number of students there that went on to form AV companies, among them Aurora Innovation, an interesting business called RideFlux in Korea. And that's because we were focused on mobile robotics, which is another way to say the precursor for autonomous vehicles. Formed nuTonomy, which was an MIT spinoff in 2013 with a colleague, Emilio Frizzoli. From 2013 to 2017, this is going to sound quaint, but we raised about $20 million in capital. We were partly bootstrapped and partly venture funded. We sold that business. We had the benefit of being able to see over the horizon and understand the capital needs in AV. And we quickly understood that they would be measured in billions and not tens or hundreds of millions. And so it just seemed to me that this was very quickly becoming not a venture play, but really a strategic play. And the question was when, not if, we would join a strategic. And so we ended up selling the business in 2017 after a pitched battle with the board to convince them to sell at that time. But it was the right thing to do for the business, and it was the right time to do it. So we joined Aptiv in 2017. In 2020, we formed a joint venture with Hyundai called Motional. The reason we did that was because although Aptiv is a $20 billion market cap business, we realized we need even more capital from even deeper pockets. And so enter Hyundai, which is kind of a Toyota scale business when you look across the entire Hyundai Motor Group. And that was a great partnership. Hyundai was a great business, and I ran that company as CEO for several years, up until it became majority owned by Hyundai and became effectively a business unit of that organization. And so at that time, decided I was interested in doing something a little bit more entrepreneurial, getting a bit back to my roots in robotics. And so joined a company called Vecna Robotics as CEO about a year and a half ago. That's where I am today. We'll talk about that a bit, but at the end of the day, a robotic forklift is not all that different from a robotic vehicle on passenger, a robotic passenger vehicle on public roads. I think it might actually be a better business, but that is a topic also for further discussion. But that's where I am today, CEO of Vecna. So I'm very happy to join the discussion today.
Yeah, wonderful to have you here, Karl. Gil.
Thank you so much. And it's really a great pleasure to be here to hear from Karl. I've known Karl for many, many years, I think beginning at MIT, but then I funded him from my seat at DARPA when I was a program manager there for 5.5 years, and also funded Vecna at that time. So sort of have been connected in many, many ways. Anyway, I'm a huge admirer, and Karl, I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. For everybody else, I'm the chief scientist at Toyota and also the CEO of Toyota Research Institute. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Talking about someone who has a full arc of autonomy, I think Gil is the one doing that as well. Thank you for joining us. So, Karl, let's start with the conversation. We will cover 5 different aspects. Let's start with the technology side, right? As we mentioned, you start from being a PhD student doing really basic science all the way to joining Urban Challenges, Pioneer, then running the business. Can you give us a sense of the the evolution of the AV technology, several different generations of this innovation here?
Yeah, I mean, I can at a very high level try to do that and very much in summary. But I think the way I tend to think about it is in a few different phases of tech maturity. You know, the first generation, I kind of jokingly referred to it as the bad old days. The reality is, at the early stage of autonomous vehicle development, and I would say this roughly aligns with, 2010 to maybe late teens, 18, 19, 20. So think DARPA Grand and Urban Challenge era, Google driverless car era, and first wave of AV startups. The reality is the technology was far from mature, did not work sufficiently well to have a truly driverless vehicle on public roads. And investors in this space were really, whether they knew it or not, underwriting a very meaningful technology risk. The question at that time, which we had to speak to at every discussion, was, will this technology ever work? And I would say the consensus view was that it probably wouldn't. Obviously, there were many people that believed it would, and I included myself in that group and our investors, and I know Gil was in that group. But I will tell you, even there were many nights where, trying to get to sleep at night, where I wasn't 100% convinced that it was going to work, or if I was convinced, I couldn't tell you exactly when it was going to work. So that was kind of the first generation. But what changed really was, I guess we could call it modern machine learning, which kind of started with CNNs and then deep learning and its kind of progression variance through transformers and now LLMs and beyond. And that had, I would say, an immediate transformative impact on the tech stack. All right. And where it started first was in the area of perception, which for many years was the frontier problem in autonomous vehicles. The general consensus was perception is the hardest problem in AV. And once we can solve that, we've got this thing licked, which that part did not turn out to be true. But it was true that perception is incredibly hard. And without, I would say, the happy accident of ML, I don't think we'd have driverless cars on the road today. And I say it's a happy accident because those advances did not come through the AV community as such. This was ImageNet and descendants like figuring out how to, segment, classify, interpret images at a level that was so far superior than the current state of the art that it just kind of, it blew me away. And so virtually overnight, we had vehicles that could perceive the environment at a level of fidelity that was sufficient to make good decisions off of. Whereas before it was, you were suffering from a little bit of a garbage in, garbage out problem. And so at that point, and this is all fairly recent, driverless cars, I think the key question shifted from, is this technology ever going to work to, let's talk about business model. And, I know we're going to get to that. So those were, to me, that was the big watershed moment in AV, the before and after moment. And there's obviously evolution from there. I think the questions more recently are around representations and how much of the technology stack to fold into a monolithic ML model or how to apportion that model and to define intermediate stages. To me, these are a little bit window dressing, to some extent marketing, but not entirely. My point is just, I don't think that is any longer the fundamental question of AV, and it's not where differentiation is likely to be found. And I think that's because there's likely to be trade-offs. So for example, a certain approach, a technical approach that offers better generalization might be outweighed by complexity and invalidation and testing and vice versa. What we're trying to get to as an industry today, now that we have a baseline, proof of concept, existence proof of a viable working tech stack, and I'm referring primarily to Waymo, but not only to Waymo, is how can we now have a tech stack that can be rapidly deployed across multiple markets with a relatively small marginal engineering costs for each new market. That's now the differentiation. So you might have a startup, like a Wave or someone like that who can say, yes, but we have something that also works, but we can go into more cities more quickly. Great. It's not to say that's, a Three Sigma issue. It's not fully at the margin, but the biggest challenges in AV have have been addressed in my opinion, quite an amazing way.
Wow. Oh, thank you. So you see, the major pivot from this symbolic logic to this learning base, right? Let us zoom into this modern AI approach a little bit. Almost now, all the AV players saying that they have a dual layer architecture. You have the end-to-end part that's probabilistic based on this foundational model. Then you have the deterministic layer that guard the safety box on this, right? Then they say the two will work together on this, right? So, Karl, I would like to get your comment on one is, okay, see, if all of the take this architecture, as you see, any differentiator between the players, or maybe it's the other thing differentiate, but also a little bit more technically, we have the end-to-end layer, then you have determinant layer. Then when do you trigger each of the two on this, right? How the two really work with each other and given a particular situation there.
Yeah, look, I don't have enough insight into the specific. That's a pretty specific technical question.
Right.
That's why, you have these teams of very smart, very well compensated people trying to figure it out. And I don't have sufficient insight into each team's individual technical approach. Everyone would answer your question, I think, in a slightly different way. Those are important questions, but I don't think any longer they're the key question, in the field. I do think the question in the field has shifted one from a technical approach to a business model approach. And I do think also, I'd say further, Jinhua, I think it's not a well-posed question in the sense that there are many different ways to answer it in a satisfactory way. And that's a good thing, right? That is a very good thing.
Right.
I do remember, Gil mentioned DARPA, but I remember participating in a DARPA challenge, which was focused on, to answer the question, can we have a end-to-end machine learning model that will let a robot navigate across really an open field? Mm-hmm. And that was actually, I think, the second or third time that the robotics field had tried to solve that problem. And didn't solve it very well at that time, but it was the same set of questions
I see.
they're asking today that you just raised. And those are the right questions. It's like, where do we put deterministic guardrails? Where do we allow essentially a regression type function to take over? And there are significant trade-offs, as I mentioned, around testing and validation, around the amount of data you need. On the one hand, testing and validation, on the other hand, the amount of data you need to sufficiently train a model to achieve some, appropriate level of performance. There are regulatory questions and kind of a legal and liability question around explainability of the system when accidents do occur. So it's a complicated one. Again, I think it's a problem with multiple solutions. I think I hinted at kind of a marketing issue. Yeah, I see a little bit companies in the space trying to differentiate around that. And to me, it's a little bit of a red herring, only because I don't think anyone is going to say we've solved this in a way that nobody else can figure out, and that's what's going to separate us from the others. I think what's going to separate one business from another right now is really it's around the way they approach the market. It's certainly access to capital. It's around partnership structure. It's around an intelligent approach to the regulatory landscape. And ultimately, it's around building a sustainable business.
I see. Yeah, thanks. So last one in the kind of a technical section is about this social intelligence, right? We heard from most cities that often the complaints, the car doesn't know how to interact with the first responder, for example, right? Do you think this need to be solved at the AV technology level, or we should just have a different social structure to manage in these type of cases?
Yeah. I mean, the thing about vehicles, there's an analogy to humanoids here. This is a robot that's being designed to work within the built environment. And so you have to adapt to the built environment and the existing environment, which in this case, includes first responders. To me, the key question is how you approach the problem from a technical approach that allows you to seamlessly interact as a normal passenger vehicle will. I think that's the only answer. And the good news is, obviously there's a couple of different approaches there. There's a machine learning based approach where you say, I'm just going to learn how these first responders physically signal to and try to communicate with a passenger vehicle and interpret that very accurately. And there's an approach where you say it's just sufficient to, recognize that there's a first responder there, and then I can call for help. There's a big discussion in the industry recently, which to me is, I don't want to say baffling, but a little bit surprising. And it's the discussion around remote operation. It speaks to, and this is not a criticism, but it just speaks to a little bit of naivete around the field and the state of the art on behalf of, in some cases, fairly informed commentators. I certainly don't blame politicians because they don't know much about anything, but we do have informed commentators who are shocked to hear that there's remote operation of these vehicles. The implication being that the technology should be perfect, which is obviously not true. For anyone who's ever, spent an hour with a robot. Remote operation is a massive feature for AV and not a bug. And this is a perfect example where, remote operation, obviously done in an intelligent way, not remote driving, but some kind of supervisory control. But this is the perfect application where you could deploy some kind of remote supervisory control and basically address this issue, to a sufficient level of fidelity.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah. So let's move to the second section. Let's talk about the economics and the potential business model of AV, right? I want to put them into maybe 3 levels. One is the economics of the development of the technology, right? The fact that Waymo spent like 50 billion roughly on this versus the development of the car, right? Also manufacturer, etc. And then lastly is the economics of the operation. So on the development of the economic development part, I'd like to hear your general comment on how does it work, right? But also another more narrow one is, given the change of the technology as you described, would that substantially reduce the cost of the development? To what degree that you feel? Really? Yes.
Yeah, to me, like I said, I think this is very important. As I said a moment ago, for many years, the fundamental question in the industry was, will the technology work? Now the fundamental question is, how good of a business will AV be? Not will it be a business, but how good of a business? And my feeling today, if I were put on the spot to summarize it, I would say I think it'll be a decent business. And I'll get back to that in a second. But there's 3 elements you just spoke to, Jinhua. There's technology development, which is very expensive and has required billions of dollars, obviously, in aggregate and even at individual players of investment. And I don't think that really matters at all. I'm not a CFO, but I do know that some costs are forgiven if you can build on the back of that a large and profitable business. And I think given the size of the potential opportunity and the revenue potential, the revenue generation potential for these companies, the single digit to low double digit billions of dollars of research investment are, they're going to make a lot of companies nervous, and many companies don't have the wherewithal to approach that sort of investment. But from just an economic perspective, I think the potential upside is going to far outweigh the investment when we look back at this in a couple of years. The other 2 points, though, I think are more interesting.
On the vehicle.
There's the vehicle
vehicle
dimension
side,
and the value chain dimension.
Right. Maybe let me on the economic vehicle side. So from one side, the average cost of a vehicle in US, passenger vehicle, is $50,000. That's without any other of these major sensors, hardware, computing, etc. Right? How much can we add on to that? Then the other different thing is, in China, you see the Apollo generation 6 of the AV car, the vehicle with the full stack, including the LiDAR camera, etc., they claim costing $40,000, right? So there's a major gap there. What do you think about this car industry will evolve given this?
Well, I mean, the first observation is for AV developers, their competition is not other AV developers. I mean, far from it. Their competition are Ubers and taxis. And more specifically, their competition is UberX. Uber Black is what, 2% of the market, maybe 3%. But so your competition as an AV developer is not, whether you've got a cheaper AV stack than, pick another AV developer. It's the guy with the fully depreciated Toyota Corolla, who's been driving it for 12 years and is going to drive it for another 6 years. So that's the competition. Right now, AVs are expensive. The true economics today, the current generation, are absolutely brutal for anybody, and not probably including the Chinese players, because it's not clear to me that that's an apples to apples comparison. The promise in the industry is the next generation, or more likely the generation after that. I think, again, I say that, pretty carefully. I don't think it's the next generation. I think there'll be significant costs out. but it's really the generation after that where you have significant cost out on the sensor stack in particular, compute, but also you've reached sufficient scale, and scale in auto is, as important as anything else. So that's the point at which you have a vehicle which can be to first order cost competitive with the guy driving the Toyota Corolla. It doesn't have to be equal. You can be more expensive because remember, there's no guy in there. That revenue to the guy, the value to this going to the guy is now going to the AV developer. But that is the competition because in steady state, what you're running is a taxi business. I never thought I would grow up. I realized this at one point. I never realized I was going to grow up dreaming of running a taxi business, but that's what we were doing, at Motional, and that's what AV players are doing. Uber has shown that there's potential when you offer a better product for meaningful market expansion. And I do think that further market expansion is possible. I think when you offer AV and it's a better product, more people will consume mobility services. I believe that. I think price expansion is likely to be very limited. People just won't pay for mobility. The first, second, third, and fourth consideration is price. The fifth is waiting time. Nothing else matters. It's great if you get a good car. You say, oh, I had a great Uber on the way here. But I don't think you make a decision based on it. So if an AV player is going to be price comparable to an Uber Black service, they don't have, a meaningful business at the scale that's of any interest. So you have to get to that stage, and I think that will happen in a couple of generations. I think the game right now for AV players is how do you get to that stage? How do you keep the ball in the air? That's fine. I think the question right now, as you're putting $300,000 plus vehicles on the road, and scaling, and I say that in quotes because we're on the order of single-digit thousands, which is not super exciting from a true business perspective. But how much scaling can you afford? Because you're materially loss-making on every vehicle. Now, it's not as bad as it seems. If you look at numbers that like Waymo has published, it's actually kind of amazing and impressive how much utilization they've been able to deliver. All that matters for a vehicle, when you cut through all the noise of the analysis of what goes into the unit economics, really what really matters is two things: the BOM cost of the vehicle and the utilization. You get a cheap vehicle and can keep it moderately utilized, 60% or so, like you're in business. It's too expensive, forget it. If you're underutilized, forget it. So that's really all that matters. And right now, we're way off on the BOM part. We're doing great on the utilization part, but unfortunately, I think the asterisk there is that for small volumes, which is where we are today, you can pick and choose where you deploy and you can drive utilization. And the key question is what happens when we scale up? So my point of all this is to say, Jinha, there are material challenges on the unit economic side that I do think iron themselves out in about 3 to 4 years.
Right.
There is a key question, though, on how much utilization you can keep driving at scale. But I think the unit economics, it's a little bit tough.
Yeah.
The last thing you touched on was just the value chain, and I think that's pretty hard too, because we're talking about putting a large fleet of vehicles on the road, and conceivably, depending on which model path companies go down, a larger fleet than really exists today in mobility services in terms of from an asset ownership perspective, and that becomes one of the key questions: who's going to own these vehicles? You're going to have multiple asset owner partners. It's another mouth to feed in the value chain. I think that, to me, is probably the most fascinating question that exists in the industry today. Over the coming 5 years, how will the value chain shake out? Who's going to own the asset? And will AV players shift to more of an asset-light model, which is more of a licensing model, which obviously would cap their revenue upside, but potentially provide a more attractive business profile?
Yeah, indeed, as you say at the beginning, it's a decent business, but unlikely to be a high profit margin business in that.
That's because it's really hard. You're running a taxi service. You're competing with competitors who have the ability to go down in price, and that's because individual drivers, unfortunately, don't understand their own unit economics. And as I mentioned, I think the price, the ability to drive price upward, is probably going to be somewhat limited. And you've got a complex system that you have to keep on the road, that you have to service and maintain, that you have a lot of, just person hours to throw into this thing. It's not a software play where, the marginal cost is zero and you can just keep cranking out licenses, with the possible exception that I kind of mentioned a moment ago. So, I think it's going to be a hard business. I think that's the option. You've invested a lot. It's a hard business, but it is also, with all this said, it is a very large opportunity. So these big businesses that aren't going to have software company profiles that might be, short of that. And look, that's a big prize in its own right. So I don't mean to be too negative about this at all. I think it's a big opportunity. I just think in the early days of AV, me doing my napkin math back in 2012, thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be a profit machine. The more we learn, I think the less true that's likely to be.
See. Yeah, and also you can see that Waymo itself is exploring at least 3 different business models. For example, in San Francisco, they run everything. They own the stack, they have the vehicle, they run the user interface. In Phoenix, they contract out with Move, who actually do the fleet management. In other cities, they work with Uber for Uber to be the frontier, like the customer interface here. Right? So exploring the possible way of arranging those things. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right, Jinhua. I think it's all really interesting. I think, look, I explained that first model as an R&D, kind of the obvious play. No one's going to own a fleet for you when it's tiny. The second and third, I think, are very interesting. And obviously having, an Uber as an intermediary, owning the network effect, and owning the customer relationship. If you're a Waymo, it's, I'm sure, an enormous question internally on how you approach that relationship kind of as you scale up. And if you really want to capture much of the value in this market, you have to own that relationship with the customer. But that's a tall task.
See, yeah, great. Thank you. So the third part, right? Talk about autonomy applied to the passenger vehicle versus applied to the robotics in the warehouse, right? You have experience running both companies in both industry. Give us the sense of what's the similar, what's the foundational that's common, and what's the differentiator between the two industries?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I was, ready to kind of take a next career step. I'm looking around at industries that I thought were interesting. I'm a roboticist at heart, not totally an automotive guy, even though I grew up in the Detroit area. And so I wanted to do something in robotics, but wasn't necessarily, it didn't have to be AV. And I started looking into logistics and warehouse automation. And, to state the obvious, the technology for a robotic passenger vehicle, very similar to a robotic forklift, right? It's just perception, navigation, control, a bit of decision making, remote support. All of those elements are, I would say, identical. All right. The difference is that operating in a warehouse is much easier, orders of magnitude easier. You're in a controlled environment. You have controlled lighting conditions, very few agents in the environment, kind of a small, discrete set of the types of agents. You have people walking around in vests, for God's sake. Like, it is solvable with kind of, I don't want to say legacy technology, but prior generation technology. You don't need a $20 million a year data pipeline to train a state-of-the-art frontier model to navigate an autonomous forklift. And I thought, well, that's interesting. It'd be nice to have a slightly easier technical problem to think about. And then as I looked into the economics, without sharing any kind of inside information, look, a taxi across 2 shifts in a busy market can generate about, let's say, 90K a year. That's about right, 80 to 100, something like that. A forklift, let's say if you wanted to lease an autonomous forklift to a company, well, what would they pay? Well, if you have 2 workers, each making $20 an hour, $30 fully burdened. So across 2 shifts now, 2 workers, 1 spot on the factory floor, 2 workers, you're offsetting potentially $120,000 in labor costs. Could you charge 90K for the forklift? I mean, maybe you could. So it just seemed to me, wow, you could charge almost as much for this autonomous forklift, which has 1/100th of the development cost and complexity as an autonomous car. I thought, well, this sounds pretty interesting. But more seriously, there are certain benefits of operating on private grounds in a controlled environment. I would say there's material benefits of that because you don't have the regulatory complexity, you don't have the legal liability exposure. And lastly, the warehouse space is 1 step more mature from a business model and kind of business maturity perspective, in the sense that there are, plenty of customers using this technology today. The question is about growth and scaling and looking at margin profile and all these things that I really didn't have a ton of experience with. As in my prior roles, I used to joke that even though I was responsible for the P&L, it was the L, and there was not a lot of P. And so this is a little bit different, and I've learned a lot, and it's been actually really, really interesting. A different view of the technology, again, sort of a different view of technology development and how to develop technology that's sufficient for the task, kind of fit for purpose. I'm very tempted to go out and develop a foundation model for warehouses. I just don't think the business demands it. So, but it's great. It's, these systems are delivering a lot of value for companies today. And thinking about America, North America in particular, and the US, like this reshoring, the reshoring initiative, bringing manufacturing back to the US is going to be very difficult without automation, minimally to augment labor. I don't see how that happens. So, I was thrilled to be part of AV, and I'm still very close to the field and follow it very closely because I felt like it was an important field for society. I know that sounds a little bit maybe grand, but I believe that to be true. And I feel that automation is similarly important. I don't view it through the lens of a negative of labor removal. I view it through the lens of labor augmentation. And when it's removing jobs, these are jobs that are difficult and very dangerous. Obviously, passenger cars is a societal nightmare. Forklift deaths are pretty terrible as well.
Yeah, on the warehouse side, as you see, the technology is simpler, right? And there's a vast demand in the industry. Tell us a little bit about the style of the industry. Are they conservative? Are they very aggressive in adopting new technology? How hard do you have to sell to the warehouse to use my robots here?
Yeah, it's interesting. The customer set is conservative. These are competitive, low margin environments where the downside risk is high. If you screw up in a logistics environment, a single shipment, it can cost you your monthly profit. And so it's conservative in the approach to adoption of technology. It's been interesting to, read studies about automation adoption across countries. And I think I don't know for sure, but I trace it back to a couple of factors. One is societal, and the view toward robotics and the willingness to embrace technology and view it as a positive enabler rather than a downside risk. And the second, when you think about incentives and kind of the role of a federal government or a local government in encouraging automation and viewing that as a strategic, important, area to invest in, I think that's something where the U.S. has been lagging. And I think those two things together, at least in part, explain why we have a pretty significant gap between our technology adoption, robotics and automation in the US compared to other countries. So that's been a bit of a headwind, to be honest, and one that I didn't appreciate coming in. So the somewhat conservative nature of the customer.
I see. Thank you. Yeah. So the fourth part, let's broaden this autonomy from the passenger vehicle and warehouse to robotic in general, and also specifically this type of a humanoid on this, right? So from one side, clearly humanoid is much more challenging in the much more variety of environment. At the same time, the modern AI, as you put it, maybe gives some possibility for this to be tackled on that, right? I'd like to hear your view about where the industry stands today.
Well, for humanoids, I am, extremely excited about the potential of humanoids. I'm a massive booster and encouraging all the investment in the humanoid space because the trickle-down effects to other fields will be absolutely enormous. And I'm also, obviously very skeptical of what I read, and that's because a lot of there's a hype cycle that's unfortunately, somewhat unsustainable, but that's okay. A little bit of a digression, but what's interesting to me in both humanoids and AV is I would argue that the federal government has played a role in catalyzing investment in this area in a way that, like, I personally never would have predicted, never in my lifetime would have predicted would be possible. And I'm referring to the DARPA challenges, the DARPA Grant and Urban Challenges, catalyzing investment in AV, showing what's possible by brute force, really. And the humanoid investment to a certain extent as well. That event, it was referred to as the Woodstock of robotics. It absolutely was. And I think it made people realize that, humanoid robots, you have to squint at it at the time because they were falling over and doing dumb shit, but like they could actually do useful work. And so fast forward, now you've got companies, academic teams, and whether the investors realize this or not, academic teams being bankrolled to the tune of hundreds of millions to billions of dollars to develop fundamental foundational technology for humanoids. So I think, look, I see many parallels to AV for good and ill. The good being that the investment's absolutely merited. The societal impacts, the potential are, off the charts big. But the hype in both fields was just way beyond reality, ultimately not helpful for the industry, but also very understandable because the loudest voices, which, the media, entrepreneurs and investors are all mutually incentivized to create hype. So there's no scenario where the hype doesn't just completely get turned up to 11, really almost to the point of absurdity. But as I mentioned, if you think about AV, the trickle-down effects to industries like warehouse robotics, to drones, to any other robotic application you can think of, they have benefited not just from direct investment that's created, models that were open source, but to individuals, right? To the talent pool that has grown by 100x since we started trying to recruit in AV. So I think humanoids will follow a hype cycle just as AV did. I think there'll be some early wins and successes. There'll be a long and cold winter, and then there'll be humanoids doing, profoundly useful work in a number of areas, somewhere between 5 to 10 years from now.
Wow, thank you. Yeah. So the last part, right? In the audience, many of them are students, younger generation researchers, entrepreneurs, etc. Many of us sincerely see you as a hero here, right? As a role model, really dare to try, take the risk of doing this. So now, what advice you like to give to the younger generation in this broader field?
Well, I think it's a lot of it's a much more sane risk today than it was, 15 years ago or whenever I started. And I only say that because the capital markets are more, receptive to robotics ventures. The technology is so much better that actually building a viable product that can generate revenue and profitable revenue is a much more realistic, likelihood than it was at the time we started nuTonomy. At that time, like I said, we had some napkin math and like some very hard squinting at the future to believe that we could create something of value. We really, quite frankly, at that moment, were thinking, well, look, our down case here is we know we can build better technology than the best ADAS systems out there because those are just terrible. This was, again, years ago. So worst case scenario, we can go work with a car maker and build an ADAS system. We didn't have to quite go down that path. I think for, people creating ventures today, really the world is your oyster today. I think if we were having this conversation 12 to 18 months from now, what's going to happen is investors are going to realize that some of the very quick wins that maybe they had hoped for in humanoids maybe won't materialize, and they may move on to a next, more exciting field. But I do think it's massive opportunity. Look, it's been interesting to kind of see this space through a few different lenses. One, through kind of core foundational technology development. Two, through the startup kind of growth phase. But then also developing technology within a corporate entity, which is an inevitable outcome for many companies. And that's kind of represents success for many startups. And kind of understanding how to balance business investor expectations with technical reality has been also fun and interesting. And then lastly, kind of at a more growth stage of a business where you're really working hard just to get to, EBITDA break even and beyond. All of those have been interesting. I don't regret a moment at any of them, all kind of different and rewarding in different ways. So it's been a lot of fun. I never would have believed you could make a business or a career out of robotics, but yeah, here we are.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much, Karl. Here, Gil, you know Karl so closely, professionally, personally. You're the best commentator on this. So please offer some remarks. Gil, please.
Sure. Thank you so much. And Karl, that was a wonderful, wonderful set of comments. I think that you are right on, extremely incisive and just so clarifying, I think, for everything that you said. I had wanted to sort of add one more thing to your analysis of sort of whether automated vehicles for shared rides are going to be successful or not, or what kind of a business it is going to be. I think that it's important, and this is a thing that I've only realized recently, to realize that a automated mobility as a service ride is qualitatively different than going for a ride in a taxi or in an Uber or a Lyft. I think that from a psychological point of view, there's a number of advantages that could allow for, I think, further market share. One of which is the vehicle is clean. The second is there are no personal items in the trunk. Along with the cleanliness, maybe a third one, it doesn't smell bad. And this all has to do with, just the remarkably good job that Waymo in particular has been doing in helping you feel really good about that. And then there's all of the psychology of there not being another person in the car, a stranger, a person that you don't know. And even for the Black service Moz rides, it's still not the same as sort of just going for a non-human or just a machine that you use. And the analogy that I'll make is that this is really a different product in the same way that a vacuum cleaner is different than a broom. Both are used to clean the floor, but one of them is a qualitatively kind of different product and enables of course, much better cleaning to be done, even though it doesn't save time. So we used to think about this purely in economic terms, like, okay, you don't have to pay the driver anymore, or in safety terms, that maybe the automated vehicle is more safe. But I think that there's this whole other thing of what the user experience is like. And I think that it bears us thinking a lot more about that. The final thing that I'll add is about the smoothness and the sort of quality of the ride. Many people feel motion sick or scared when the vehicle moves in an unexpected way. And every time that you go for a ride that's driven by a stranger, you have no idea what you're going to get. And then maybe one more thing. I'm sorry, I said that would be the last, but one more thing is personal safety and whether the statistics bear it out or not. For women in particular, I think these rides can be quite scary. So I don't know how this is going to evolve and how much of a difference that's going to make, but I suspect that that could be an important factor in the penetration of automated vehicles for a shared ride. In any case, thank you so much, Karl. This was really, really good, and it's been a joy to watch you. And I think the new things that you are doing now are going to be similarly successful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gil. Karl, do you want to offer some quick response to this?
Yeah, look, I agree with all of that, Gil. I think, when we started, I thought a driverless ride might be on balance a slight net negative for reasons I couldn't really articulate other than I thought people might get nervous and stay nervous in an AV. I would say what we quickly realized was that once you were in an AV and had an experience with it, you quickly became bored and accepted it. I think what I underappreciated was that, and this was only true after I had truly driverless rides. So it took that experience to kind of acknowledge and understand that it would be somewhere between a slight and a meaningful net positive. So I agree with you. I think it's a better experience. I think for women in particular, it's a much better experience. And my only question is how people will value that and be willing to, how you can price it. My concern is that if the Waymos of the world say, you know what, yes, it's better, we're going to price it as Uber Black, and they do that, but people don't want to pay for it, well, then you're consigned to a relatively niche operation. I don't think they would do that forever. They realize they just don't have that pricing power. So to me, that's the only open question is like, what does that translate to in terms of revenues and business model and pricing power?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. On that, I think the practically the Waymo price is about 10-15% higher than the regular Uber, but lower than the Uber Black. Somehow in between, the price is that in that kind of realm.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing on the cost is also, I just learned that in China, the insurance premium for the AV-based fleet is actually cheaper than the human-based fleet. That's another that I find, wow, that's important. So the insurance industry already recognized the safety benefit of that. Yeah, great. So let me invite John in for the Q&A from the audience. John, please.
Super. Okay. Karl, lots and lots of comments and questions in the chat. We will share the chat file with you, so it's worth having a look. Let me just start out. There's a cluster of questions around the fundamental business model of robotaxi versus personally owned autonomous vehicles. So Javier Ibanez Guzman said, what about L4 vehicles for private usage? Is this a solution as we face an aging population? Robbie Michelani is asked, in contrast to AVs as a taxi service, what are the prospects of privately owned AV market? Michael Woods asked, what potential does the AV taxi service have of replacing personal car use or mass transit? So actually, let's get to Michael's question later. Just on those first two questions, how do you think about this technology being offered as a fleet, as we see with Waymo and through partnerships with Uber, versus, my personally owned automobile incorporating level 4 software into it?
Yeah, so there's kind of three elements here. There's like the fleet, the Waymo type. There's personal ownership for personal use, and then there's personal ownership for fleet use.
Yeah.
Be a good one for Gil to comment on too for that second part of it. But look, they're totally different businesses, and I don't think it's a real thing. I'm sorry to say. This Tesla thing, I mean, it's such bullshit. Sorry. The idea that you would just have your car and then you just like rent it out for 4 hours a day and it's going to come back trashed and destroyed.
Yeah.
No notion of like cleaning, maintenance. I mean, it's so absurd. I'm sorry to say. But people take it seriously and ascribe value to it. So God bless them. But I don't think that's real. I don't think there's competition. If you're a Waymo, you're worried about competition from a fleet of personally owned, kind of, fractionally rented vehicles. I think it's very, very unlikely, and at best, very marginal competition, right? Could you do that? Maybe you could. Are you likely to have a bad experience as an owner and as a rider? You're very likely to have a bad experience. And is that likely to deter you from ever doing it again? It will happen within a month. So I just don't think it's a thing. But the other thing that's interesting about that, to make that even a potential reality, the cost side of the AV stack has to be something that an owner is willing to pay for, assuming they're not viewing it like an entrepreneur to say, I'll spend $20,000 more on this because I'm going to recover my costs. And hang on a second. No, people aren't going to do that. They're going to say, wow, it's $7,000 more. Would I pay that? When I buy this new vehicle, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. Would I pay 10,000? Probably not. 12,000? Absolutely not. So can you get your tech stack down to, if it's a consumer sticker price of 6K, can you get the BOM cost down to 2,500? We're not close to there yet, notwithstanding anything Elon Musk would say, right? Is it impossible to contemplate? No. There is a path there when you have a combination of vision with next generation radar sensors, which are extremely powerful. You have no LiDAR, you have a cost optimized compute, you have an array of cameras and some kind of HD or streaming radar or whatever you want to call it. And I think you could have a system that could work pretty well. But that is that 2 generations from now that I was hinting at the beginning of my remarks. It's not the next generation. It's possibly the generation after that. So could this be a thing 8 years from now? It could be a thing. It could be a conversation that we're having, but it's not something realistic today. I'm very skeptical that you would have just a rogue fleet, self-organizing fleet that would compete with a well-organized mobility service. I don't think that's a thing. All this said, and this is why I mentioned Gil, I love the idea of a vehicle that I could buy that would be equipped with a true L4 feature, because not only would it be enormously convenient, it would be incredibly safe. And I know that one of Toyota's visions from inception, really, and they were kind of the only ones saying this, was that we'd like to have a guardian system for our cars and have like a crash-proof car. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the whole motivation for all of this. I mean, we're all, not all of us, but I'm an engineer. The motivation wasn't to go out and, make $1 billion. It was like, holy cow, this technology could save tens of thousands of lives per year just in North America. And I still very much believe that.
Gail, do you want to jump in with any quick reactions?
I have to be careful because Toyota has a policy of not criticizing any other OEM. So
I don't have that
I cannot opine upon Karl's strongest comment. But what I can say is that I think that you are exactly right. And with regard to personally owned vehicles, it's really about cost. And we have to understand that right now, profitability in the car manufacturing industry as a whole is very, very difficult. Costs for raw materials and other components are going up, and there's kind of this affordability ceiling for, how much can we raise the price, if at all, now. And so that is kind of a pincer of sorts that the whole industry is facing, and that makes this challenge of adding L4 as an example to the car even worse. That said, I think there are lesser expensive ways of raising safety in cars, and I think we're seeing a lot of that. And so the active safety systems, what we used to call the Guardian system, are getting better and better while still staying affordable. And so really it's a question of what is the true value that the personally owned vehicle customer sees in adding self-driving to their car as well? And are there potentially more valuable for the dollar answers here? I think traffic jam assist, as an example, is very feasible and can be done at fairly low cost, and people love it because they hate standing in traffic and having to manage the car at the same time. And adding safety features first, I think, makes a lot more sense. Thank you.
Super. Okay, I want to get to Michael's question, which is, what potential do you see for Robotaxi to replace personal car usage or mass transit? Those are two very different questions. I've said for a long time that anyone who thinks you're going to take the population of the London Tube and bring them up to the surface streets and put them in pods and have a better mobility solution for London needs to get their head examined. But what's your view on that, Karl? I mean, do you seriously think that Robotaxi could somehow disrupt public transportation? Do you think public transportation needs to remain as a core part of an urban mobility system? What thoughts, if any, do you have on that?
I mean, it's a great question. It's really one for like the true mobility nerds. And I think there's probably an interesting analogy to be drawn, with the Uber experience and how that drew off. There was so much discussion at the time, much of it by Lyft, a little bit less by Uber, about how people would not have a personally owned vehicle and be willing to, use ride hail if, the economics were a certain way. My understanding, what we did see, and this was quite amazing to me, and I mentioned this about the potential of this for AV, but in ride hail, and especially when it was the early days and it was subsidized and kind of artificially low price, was a tremendous market expansion in certain markets of ridership of vis-a-vis traditional taxis, right? So if the traditional taxi market in San Francisco was X, Uber made that 2X or something like that. It was a material growth. And as Gil and I think we're both saying, AV is a better experience. And if it can be a cost competitive, better experience, I do think there's potential to grow that market even further. I think people will choose to use that mobility service more than they would have opted to use their personally owned vehicle. Absolutely. I don't know how much. If I had to just guess at it, I wouldn't guess it would be on the same order of magnitude as an Uber versus a taxi experience, because you went from a truly terrible experience in many markets to like a good experience. And this is going from good to something better than that. But I think it could be meaningful. But the mass transit question, I think, has a lot more complexity. I mean, you have a much lower cost option. You have an option that's moving a much higher volume of ridership. Part of me hopes it's not the case that you're trading off mass transit for AV, because I think the implications for that, could be really unfavorable for congestion, among other things. But I don't know the answer. I think it's a great question, though.
Super. Okay. Just in the last minutes, there's a cluster of questions around the really important topic of trust and trust in technology. So Brenda Gessner asked, who should be in charge of the framework or ethics in this industry? Bert Baker asked, what are your thoughts on the lack of transparency by AV companies? Okay, this is a loaded question. Are AV companies, in fact, lacking transparency? Are they manipulating the numbers and only showing numbers that support their public acceptance? What are your overarching views here? First, on the question of trust and transparency.
You know, I don't think I'm biased anymore. I think it's massive transparency, as far as I can tell, compared to the state of the art. We live in America. Companies don't care about any of us, and they don't share any information with anyone unless they're legally compelled to do so. Meanwhile, we've got companies like Waymo, when we were at even nuTonomy, sharing with the city of Boston voluntarily, and then it was codified, but Waymo voluntarily sharing information about their accident statistics. I couldn't say at all whether or not they're true or not. My guess is they are. I suspect the downside risk for them for fudging the data is much higher than the upside benefit of sharing accurate data. They've shared, there's a requirement if you're going to get on the road in California to share a tremendous amount of data in order to meet their certification stages. Not true in most other states, but in California in particular, that's the case. So to me, what I've experienced in AV around transparency, both voluntary and sort of by regulation, far exceeds what I would have thought is possible or likely, and far exceeds what I see in many other instances in the automotive industry in particular, where you have obviously unsafe systems on the road, the Tesla systems, obviously unsafe and unfit for purpose, that to me, there's been zero transparency around. I have not seen any data about these systems that we share the road with every day. I think it's absolutely absurd. So I think AV, if I were to score it, today I give them an A. Could it degrade in the future? It could. Maybe an A minus. There's always room for improvement. They probably don't deserve an A. But let's call it an A minus. But, you know, that's just my view.
Just in closing, Karl, you mentioned when you were talking about remote operations that AVs are not perfect. And I guess what's interesting is, why do we actually expect them to be? In a world where we know cars crash and, we know 100 people today will die on the roads in the US, and that happened yesterday and that will happen tomorrow. And we know that iRobots get stuck under chairs, right? When we buy an iRobot, we kind of expect that it might get stuck under a chair and we need to rescue it. So it's interesting that our societal expectation is for this form of perfection when our current system is so drastically imperfect.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can't argue with what people think. I mean, we know that the tolerance for human error is vastly higher than the tolerance for machine error, but it's hard to quantify how much higher. That's why this whole question of how safe is safe in the AV industry was and continues to be a question. We know that there is tolerance for error, right? Plane crashes happen infrequently, but they happen. And despite that, we still get on planes. So there's a limit, at which we've had enough positive experiences and have had infrequent enough reminders that technology is fallible, that we're willing to overlook the infrequent terrible accidents. And there will be terrible accidents with AV, and there'll be front page news for quite a long time when they happen. But there will be a point, and should the industry and society be lucky enough, I think, for us to reach that point, and there's probably an element of luck involved here, but if we reach that point, we'll tolerate the errors that do occur. But I couldn't quantify when that is. I think, again, there's probably interesting analogies to be drawn with the aerospace industry and the evolution of how that's played out. And my hope is it plays out something like that we get to a point where we have a very safe technology. There are occasional accidents. We tolerate them. We don't ever do this value judgment and trade-off on what the human, accident rate would do, because that's just not how we're wired. But yeah, I hope we get to that point.
Yeah, indeed. How do we convert this from a binary discussion to a continuous discussion, talk about real numbers? I remember, Karl, you mentioned that if the technology is 10 times safer in the United States, we'll still kill 4,000 people. The country will revolt.
Be a disaster.
Yeah, but 10 times safer is a massive contribution to the society.
Yeah. I mean, from a business perspective, it may be an absolute disaster. You've got no business if we're still, if you got AVs on the road and there's 4,000 accidents per year, 10 per day. We've got 10 headlines per day. 10 AV deaths today, 9 tomorrow, 11 the next day. I mean, there's no industry at that point. So 100 times safer, if you remove the entire fleet, to just do a counterfactual here, remove the entire fleet, replace them with AVs, 100 times safer. You go from 40,000, from 4,000 to 400. One accident per day, is that safe enough? I would say, God, no. One accident per day, 1,000 times safer for a year, maybe. So maybe you got to be about 1,000 times safer. I don't know.
Right. I actually remember that ambition for this to be 1,000 times safer in the early stage. That's indeed an ambition on this, right? That's wow. But we're out of time. Thank you so much, Karl. This is really brilliant. Everybody, please join me. Thank Karl for the presentation and the conversation.
Thank you. Great discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Karl, if you don't mind, stay for a bit of a quick debriefing, talk about some logistics, like 2 minutes or so.
Sure.
For the audience, thank you for joining us. And next week, quick advertisement, we'll talk about the Ukraine, the transportation situation, planning in the war zone, and the post-war reconstruction thinking on that. So have a good weekend. See you guys next week.